The wind that howled through the San Juan Mountains on that December night carried more than just snow. It carried secrets, secrets that would change the lives of 4 people forever and end the life of a 5th. My name is Silas Rourke. I am 75 years old now, and I sit alone in the same cabin my brothers and I built with our own hands back in 1879. The fire still burns in the same stone hearth where she first warmed her frozen fingers. The same buffalo hide rug still lies before it, though the fur has thinned with the passing of 40 years. My hands shake more than they used to. My beard has gone white as the snow that falls outside my window tonight. But my memory, gentlemen, my memory is sharp as the day she stumbled into our lives. I want to tell you a story. A true story, though some of what I am about to tell you might sound like something out of a dime novel. It is the story of how 3 broken brothers found a reason to live again. The story of a young woman who had been sold like cattle to a man who wore the robes of justice but harbored the soul of a devil. And the story of a Christmas Eve in 1883 when blood ran across snow and 3 mountain men became the only thing standing between a virgin bride and the grave that had been dug for her. So pour yourself a cup of coffee, friend. Settle into your chair and let an old man tell you about the winter that broke our hearts and saved our souls. It was the last week of November in 1883. I was 35 years old then, and I had buried my heart 5 years before in the cold Wyoming earth, alongside my wife Hannah and my 5-year-old daughter Ruth. I do not need to tell you how a man comes back from something like that, because the truth is, no man does. Not really. You learn to walk again. You learn to eat again. You learn to load a rifle and skin a beaver and chop firewood. And after a while, your hands stop shaking when you do these things. But the man who lost everything is not the man standing in his place. He is a ghost wearing borrowed skin. My 2 younger brothers, Gideon and Elijah, had come to find me in Wyoming after I had finished my work there. I will not speak much of that work tonight. Suffice it to say that 9 men who once rode together no longer rode anywhere at all, and I had not slept a full night in the 17 months it took me to find them. When my brothers arrived at the empty trading post where I had been drinking myself slowly to death, they did not ask me to come home. There was no home left. Instead, they pointed west toward the high country of Colorado, and they said, "Brother, let us build something new. Just the 3 of us, far from people, far from law, far from anything that can be taken away." And so we did. Our cabin sat at 11,000 feet on the eastern slope of a peak the local Ute people had once called Black Bear Pass. The walls were thick pine logs we had felled and notched ourselves. The roof was layered shake shingles that turned silver in the moonlight. There was a stone hearth that took up an entire wall, and a hand-cranked grindstone and pegs hammered into the beams where we hung our rifles and our coats. We had a single rough-hewn table, 3 pine chairs, 2 narrow beds in a back room, and 1 larger bed that none of us slept in. That larger bed was meant for Gideon, the middle brother, who had once been engaged to a girl in Kansas before everything went wrong for him. He had built that bed himself. He had never used it. Each of us had a role. Gideon, who was 33 and the fastest gun among us, did the hunting and most of the trading down in town. He had been a deputy sheriff in Kansas before a corrupt judge framed him for the murder of a man Gideon had every right to shoot. He stood 6'1" with rust-colored hair and green eyes that had seen too much. Elijah, our youngest, at 29, kept the cabin running. He cooked, he read, he repaired our broken tools, he tended our wounds when we got hurt. He had spent 1 year at Yale University before our family fell apart, and he carried that learning with him like a man carrying a candle through a long, dark hall. He was the heart of our little family, the one who reminded us that we were still men and not animals. And me, I was the oldest. I made the decisions when decisions had to be made. I scouted the trails. I kept watch when the wolves came too close. I had been a cavalry sergeant in the war between the states, and I had learned in those 4 years how to read the smallest signs of trouble. The way a horse holds its ear. The way a stranger glances twice at the door he came through. The way a woman flinches when a man reaches for her wrist. That last skill, gentlemen, that last skill is what changed everything. We came down to Silverton on the second to last day of November. The pantry was running low. We needed coffee flour, salt, gunpowder, lamp oil, and a new whetstone for Elijah, who had broken his trying to sharpen a hunting knife the week before. The morning was gray and sullen. Clouds hung low over the peaks like wet wool. The thermometer Gideon had nailed to the porch post read 12 degrees above zero when we hitched the team to the wagon. And any man who has lived in those mountains can tell you that 12 above means a storm is gathering somewhere over the divide. Silverton was a mining town in those days, the kind of rough, scrabble place where a man could lose his money, his honor, and sometimes his life in the space of a single afternoon. The streets were churned mud and frozen horse manure. The wooden boardwalks that ran along the storefronts were warped and splintered. From the doors of the Silver Spur Saloon came the tinny notes of a piano being abused by some drunken miner trying to remember a song from back east. 3 Irish prospectors stood arguing in front of the assayer's office, their breath steaming in the cold. A pair of British engineers in tweed coats walked past us, talking quietly about some new vein of ore in the high country. The town smelled of wood smoke and whiskey, and the sour ferment of a place where too many lonely men were trying to forget their lives. We tied our team in front of Abernathy's Mercantile. It was the largest dry goods store in Silverton, run by a tall, stooped Scotsman named Angus Abernathy, who had come west 30 years before and somehow survived every gold rush, silver bust, and bandit raid the territory could throw at him. He knew everyone. He heard everything. And he had liked us from the first time we walked through his door because we paid in coin, and we did not haggle over an honest price. While Gideon checked the harness and I tied down the canvas tarp on the wagon bed, Elijah went inside to begin the order. He had been gone perhaps 3 minutes when he came back out, his face troubled. "There is something you boys should hear," he said quietly. "Old man Abernathy is in a state." I followed him inside. The store smelled of dry tobacco kerosene and the cinnamon Abernathy always kept in a glass jar on the counter. Mrs. Abernathy was somewhere in the back, humming to herself. The old man stood behind the wooden counter with his apron stained from a morning of weighing out goods, and his pale blue eyes had a look in them I had never seen before. A look of fear, not for himself, for someone else. He waited until I leaned in close to weigh a tin of black powder before he spoke. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "There is something wrong in this town, Mr. Rourke. Something deeply wrong. A young woman came in 3 weeks ago on the train from Boston. She is meant to be the bride of Judge Hensley." I knew the name. Every man in southern Colorado knew the name. Judge Josiah Hensley was 52 years old, a tall, thin man with iron gray hair, and the bearing of a Methodist minister. He was the most powerful man in Silverton. He owned the bank, half the saloon, the assayer's office, and the souls of every elected official within 50 miles. He had buried his first wife 6 years before a woman named Margaret, who had died, the official record said, of a sudden fever. There were those in town who whispered that the fever had come from a brown bottle on the judge's nightstand. But no one whispered loudly enough to be heard. Abernathy continued, his voice tight. "The girl is 20 years old. Her stepfather in Boston arranged the marriage through one of those mail-order advertisements in the eastern newspapers. Hensley paid him $800. The wedding is set for Christmas Day, when the girl turns 21. I felt something cold move in my stomach. $800 was a great deal of money in 1883. A working man in Silverton might earn that much in 2 full years of swinging a pickaxe in a silver mine. No man pays that kind of money for a bride unless he expects to gain something far greater in return. "Have you seen her?" I asked. Abernathy nodded slowly. "My wife saw her at the dry goods stall on Wednesday last. The girl had bruises on her wrists. Bruises she tried to hide beneath the cuffs of her sleeves. And every night, Mr. Rourke, every single night since she arrived in this town, my wife says she can hear weeping coming from the judge's house when she walks past on her way home from prayer meeting." He paused. He glanced toward the door to make sure no one was listening. "Hensley is a devil in a black coat," he said. "And I do not believe that poor girl will live to see the new year, married or not." I stepped back outside without a word. The cold hit my face like a slap. Gideon was still working at the wagon. Elijah came out behind me. I told them what I had heard. Gideon, who has always been the hot-blooded one, started toward the judge's house immediately, and I had to grab his arm to stop him. "Not now, brother," I said. "We do not even know the full shape of this thing." It was at that moment, gentlemen, that I saw her for the first time. The judge had appeared at the far end of the boardwalk, a tall figure in his black wool coat and his polished boots, walking with the slow, deliberate stride of a man who knows that the world will wait for him. In his right hand was a silver-headed walking stick that caught the dull November light, and half a step behind him, walking with her eyes on the wooden boards beneath her feet, was a young woman who stopped my heart in its tracks. She was small, not more than 5 feet 4 inches tall. Her hair was raven black, gathered in a tight bun at the nape of her slender neck. Though a few loose strands had escaped the pins and curled against the porcelain skin of her temples, She wore a dress of deep navy blue cotton, the kind of plain garment that a poor girl from a respectable Boston family might wear to church, and a thin gray wool shawl pulled tight around her narrow shoulders. The dress did nothing to hide the soft curves of a young woman in the full bloom of her youth. Her lips were red without any pain at all, the natural red of cold cherries in autumn, and they were pressed together in a thin line of fear. But it was her eyes, friends. It was her eyes that did it. Even from across the muddy street I could see them. Eyes the color of emeralds held up to a lamp. Large eyes, clear and intelligent, but emptied of every kind of hope. The eyes of a creature in a trap. The eyes of someone who has stopped believing that anything good will ever happen to her again. Gideon let out a low, quiet whistle beside me. "Lord above," he said. "She is just a child," Elijah whispered. I said nothing, but I watched the way she walked, the way her shoulders curled inward, the way she kept her head bowed even though I knew she was aware of every face on that street, every eye that turned to look at her. She was a girl who had learned sometime in the recent past that being seen was dangerous. A stray dog barked suddenly from beneath the porch of the saloon. The girl flinched. She actually flinched as if someone had struck her. The small silk parasol she had been carrying slipped from her fingers and tumbled into the slush of the boardwalk. Judge Hensley stopped. He did not raise his voice. He did not strike her. He did not, to any casual observer, do anything at all that should have given anyone alarm. He simply bent down with the practiced grace of a man performing a courtesy, picked up the parasol and handed it back to her. But as he did so, his large hand closed around her wrist. I have seen many things in my life, gentlemen. I have watched men die in battle. I have hunted killers across 3 states. I have buried my own daughter. And I am telling you that in that single moment, in the way Judge Josiah Hensley's knuckles went white against the pale skin of that young woman's wrist, I saw the entire shape of his soul. Her lower lip trembled. She bit down on it to stifle a cry. The judge smiled at her, a slow, patient smile that did not reach his eyes. And then he tucked her arm beneath his own and continued his afternoon walk down the boardwalk as though nothing in the world were wrong. I turned away. I climbed onto the wagon bench. I did not trust myself to speak. We drove out of Silverton in silence. None of us said a word for the first 3 miles. The sky behind us had begun to turn the color of an old bruise, and I could smell the storm building in the cold, dry air. Somewhere over the high peaks to the west, a great mass of weather was gathering itself, preparing to fall on the San Juans, like the wrath of God. It was Elijah who finally spoke. "We have to do something, brother," he said. "She is the lawful bride of a sitting judge," I said. "By the laws of Colorado Territory, she belongs to him as surely as that walking stick belongs to him. There is nothing we can do." Gideon spat over the side of the wagon. "The hell there is not." I did not answer him. I told myself that this was not our fight. I told myself that the world was full of cruel men and frightened women, and that we three had finally found our peace in a cabin above the tree line, and that we owed nothing to a stranger we had glimpsed for 30 seconds across a muddy street. I told myself these things, brothers, all the way up the mountain. But I could not stop seeing her eyes. The storm caught us when we were still an hour from the cabin. It came down out of the high country with a sudden violence that took even me by surprise. One moment we were moving through scattered flurries beneath a heavy sky. The next moment the world had vanished into a roaring white wall of wind and snow. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a span of minutes. The horses, good mountain animals though they were, began to stumble in the deepening drifts. I pulled my buffalo hide coat tighter around my shoulders and bent forward over the reins, squinting against the lash of ice on my cheeks. We were perhaps 4 miles from home when the wagon wheel struck a hidden boulder beneath the snow. The whole rig jolted sideways with a jarring crack. The horses shrieked. I hauled back on the reins to keep them from running, and from somewhere behind me, from the bed of the wagon beneath the lashed canvas tarp, came a small muffled cry. I sat very still for a long moment. The wind howled. The horses snorted and stamped. Gideon, who had been riding alongside on his sorrel, brought his animal in close and looked at me. "Did you hear that?" he said. "I heard it." I climbed down from the wagon bench. My boots sank knee-deep in the fresh powder. I drew my Winchester from its leather scabbard levered around into the chamber and walked slowly to the rear of the wagon. I expected gentlemen to find a starving lynx or perhaps a half-grown wolf that had crawled in among our supplies for shelter. The mountains were full of desperate creatures in winter. I gripped the corner of the frozen tarp. I pulled it back. What I saw beneath it stopped my breath in my throat. She was curled into a tight, shivering ball between a sack of flour and a wooden crate of canned peaches. Her dark blue cotton dress was soaked through. Her thin gray shawl had frozen stiff around her narrow shoulders. Her lips were the color of slate. Ice crystals had formed in her black hair, in her dark lashes, in the soft hollow at the base of her throat. She wore no winter coat, no proper boots, only thin city shoes already split at the seams. She was so cold she had stopped shivering, which any mountain man can tell you is a very bad sign indeed. When the body stops shivering in a storm like that, the body has begun to die. "Lord, have mercy," I whispered. Her eyes opened. Those great green eyes, unfocused now, glassy with the cold. She tried to push herself away from me, tried to crawl back further into the wagon, and a small broken sound came from her cracked lips. "No," she whispered. "Please, do not take me back. Let me freeze, please, let me freeze." I dropped the Winchester into the snow. I did not ask permission. I reached into the wagon bed with both arms and I scooped her up like a man scooping up a child. And she weighed nothing at all in my hands. Nothing at all, as though her bones were hollow and her flesh were paper. I carried her around to the wagon bench. Gideon had already swung down from his horse and was unbuckling his own coat. Elijah had run back from where he had been riding ahead and now stood staring at her with his mouth open. I tore my buffalo hide coat off my own shoulders and wrapped it around her body. leaving myself in nothing but my flannel shirt and my wool vest in the howling cold. I climbed up beside her. I tucked the coat tighter around her ice-covered hair. "Hold on to me," I told her. "Hold on. We are going home." She did not answer. Her head lolled against my chest. I snapped the reins. The horses lunged forward through the deepening snow. Behind me, my brothers fell into a tight protective formation, one ahead and one behind their rifles drawn against whatever else might come out of the storm. We ran those poor animals harder than we should have. We ran them up the last switchback, up the long climb to the saddle of Black Bear Pass, up to the dark line of pines that marked the edge of our claim. The sky had gone black. The snow came at us sideways, and against my chest, the small woman who had hidden in our wagon bed grew colder and colder with every passing mile. The cabin appeared out of the white, howling dark like a vision from a sermon. I do not remember unhitching the team. I do not remember kicking the door open. I only remember laying her down on the bearskin rug before the cold black hearth and hearing my own voice shouting orders to my brothers in a tone I had not used since the war. Gideon fire. Now, the biggest one we have ever built. Elijah water on the kettle. Blankets. Every blanket in this cabin. They moved. By God, they moved. Within 5 minutes, the hearth was roaring. Within 10 minutes, the cabin had begun to fill with the heavy welcome heat of seasoned pine, burning hard against good dry oak. I peeled the frozen buffalo hide off the woman's small body. Her dress was soaked through. Her skin beneath the wet fabric was the color of skim milk gone sour. And where it was not white, it was the ugly purple-gray of frostbite beginning to take hold. Modesty had no place here, gentlemen. Hypothermia kills a small frame faster than it kills a large one. And that girl had perhaps half an hour of her life left in her, if we did not get her warm and dry. But I am a man who was raised in a Methodist house, and the thought of stripping her wet clothes from her body was not a thought I was prepared to act on. I turned my back to her. I pulled the heaviest wool blanket from my own bunk and laid it within reach of her trembling hand. "I am turning around," I said in the steady, low voice I used to use with my horses when they were spooked. "You need to get out of those wet clothes. You need to wrap yourself in this blanket. If you cannot do it on your own, I will have to do it for you, and I do not believe either one of us wants that." There was a long silence, then a small broken sound that might have been a yes. I heard the slow rustle of wet fabric coming off her shivering body. I heard the heavy, ragged sound of her breath. I stared at the rough-hewn pine logs of the cabin wall, at the grain of the wood, at the dark knots in the timber, and I tried not to think about anything at all. When she whispered, "I am ready," I turned back. She had wrapped herself almost completely in the gray wool. Only her face showed above the folds. And in the bright firelight, gentlemen, in the bright firelight that I had built up so high to save her life, I saw what the dim winter daylight in Silverton had only hinted at. Her arms were covered in bruises. Dark violet finger marks had been pressed into the soft flesh of her upper arms. A faded yellow shadow ran along the line of her jaw, where someone had struck her hard enough to break the skin a week or two before. There was a fresh red welt on the inside of her left wrist that looked very much like the kiss of a leather strap. And running along her pale collarbone, just visible above the edge of the blanket, was a small round circular burn the exact size and shape of the end of a lit cigar. I have killed 9 men in my life. I have killed them for things they did to my wife and my daughter, and I have never once regretted the killing. As I knelt there in front of that fire and looked at the marks on the body of that 20-year-old girl, I felt the old cold thing wake up in my chest. The thing that had slept for 5 years. Elijah knelt beside her with a tin cup of willow bark tea, sweetened with mountain honey. He did not look at her bruises. He did not stare. He simply held out the cup with the gentle, patient hands of a man who had spent a year studying medicine before life had pulled him away from it. "Drink," he said softly, slowly. A small sip first. She took the cup in both hands. They were shaking so badly that the hot tea slopped over the rim and burned her fingers. She did not seem to notice. She drank. Color came slowly back into her cheeks. Her eyes began to clear. For a long time, none of us spoke. The fire crackled. The wind hammered the roof. Outside, the storm raged on into the deepening night. And inside our cabin, a young woman who had nearly died sat wrapped in a blanket and stared at the flames with eyes that had seen too much. I sat down across from her, cross-legged on the planks, far enough away to give her room. "What is your name?" I asked her finally. Her lips moved. The sound that came out was barely a breath. "Cora," she whispered. "Cora May Whitfield." The name hit me harder than I expected it to. A girl's name. A young name. The name of someone who should still be in Boston, eating supper with her mother, not freezing to death in the back of a stranger's wagon in the high country of Colorado. "Miss Whitfield," I said, "my name is Silas Rourke. These are my brothers Gideon and Elijah. You are at our cabin 14 miles east of Silverton on the eastern slope of Black Bear Pass. You are safe here for the moment. But I need you to understand something." She looked at me. Those green eyes met mine over the rim of the tin cup. "Your husband-to-be," I said, "Judge Hensley. He is going to send men up every trail in these mountains as soon as this storm breaks. He is a powerful man. He will tear Silverton apart looking for you. By hiding in our wagon, you have brought a hanging judge's wrath right to my doorstep, whether I welcomed it or not." Her hands began to shake so violently that the tin cup slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. Hot tea splashed across the planks. She did not move to pick it up. She looked at me with such absolute despair that I felt the breath go out of my lungs. "Please," she whispered, "Mr. Rourke, the town says you are a hard man. They say one of you killed a man in Wyoming. Please, I am begging you. Let them think I wandered off in the storm. Let them think I died in the snow. You can shoot me yourself and leave me in the drifts if you have to. Just do not take me back to that house. I would not shoot a woman," I said quietly. and the killings I have done are my business, not the business of any man in Silverton. But what you ask of me is no small thing, Miss Whitfield. Running away into the wilderness in the dead of winter is the act of a desperate soul. If the judge has hurt you, there are authorities in Denver. There are federal marshals. There are courts higher than his. She let out a sound then, a laugh, but a laugh so broken that no one in that cabin could have mistaken it for joy. It was the sound of something giving way. Authorities, she repeated. Mr. Rourke, he is the law. He owns the sheriff. He owns the telegraph operator. Every official in this part of the territory owes him his job, his land, or his reputation. Who would I tell? Who would believe a runaway bride over the most respected god? Fearing judge in southern Colorado, she closed her eyes. She rocked slowly back and forth, the small, self-soothing motion of someone who had been hurt for a very long time. Gideon sat down on the chair across from her. He set his rifle aside. When he spoke, his voice was as gentle as I had ever heard it. "What did he do to you, miss?" he asked. She opened her eyes. She looked at the fire. And then, in a thin, tired voice that hardly seemed to belong to her at all, Cora May Whitfield began to tell us her story. She had come to Silverton 3 weeks before on the railroad from Boston. Her stepfather, a man named Barnaby Stone, had arranged the marriage through a mail-order advertisement placed in 2 Eastern newspapers. Stone had received $800 from Hensley as part of the contract. The wedding was set for Christmas Day, the same day Cora would turn 21. And from that day forward, her life would belong by Massachusetts law and by the binding hand of the Methodist Church entirely to the man who had bought her. Her mother had died when Cora was 12. Her stepfather had raised her since. He had married her mother for what little property the woman possessed. And after her death, he had begun to drink heavily and to lose what remained at the gambling tables. By the time Cora was 18, Stone was a broken man scraping for any way to pay his debts. The mail-order advertisement had been his solution. She came to Silverton on the 8th of November. The judge had met her at the train station with flowers. For 3 days he had been kind to her, courteous, almost fatherly. Then everything changed. She did not give us the details, gentlemen. She did not have to. She told us only that the judge began to come to her room at night. She told us that he beat her with a leather strap when she tried to lock the door, that he burned her with the end of a cigar when she wept too loudly that he told her over and over again that her body had become his property the moment her stepfather accepted the $800 in Boston. She told us that he spoke of the wedding night with a sick patient hunger, and that he had told her more than once that on Christmas Eve he would take from her the last thing she still possessed. And then she said, her voice barely audible, "Then he told me that I would no longer be useful, the way Margaret was no longer useful. Margaret was his first wife. She died of a fever, the official record says. The old women in Silverton say it was no fever. They say the brown bottle on his nightstand killed her. They say he killed her for her money, just as he means to kill me for mine." I sat back. I looked at my brothers. Gideon's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping in his cheek. Elijah's eyes were wet. I stood up. The cabin felt suddenly too small. I walked to the window and looked out into the howling white dark of the storm. I had built my life around the simple promise that I would never again involve myself in the cruelty of the world below. I had buried my heart in Wyoming. I had come here to be alone, to be still, to wait out my remaining years in the company of my brothers and the high, cold silence of the peaks. But behind me sat a young woman who had been sold like livestock to a man who meant to murder her. And in my mind I saw again the face of my Hannah. I saw the small brown braid of my Ruth. I saw the promise I had made to them both kneeling in the dark earth of a Wyoming cemetery 5 years before. The promise that no other innocent woman would ever again be left to suffer in the hands of evil men. If I had the strength in my arms to stop it. I turned back to the room. My brothers were watching me. They knew. They had always known. "No one is taking you back," I said. Cora's eyes filled with tears. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. "I swear it on the souls of my dead wife and daughter," I told her. "You are safe in this cabin. You are safe with these 3 men. And when this storm breaks, Miss Whitfield, when the wind dies down and the trails are passable again, we are going to ride down that mountain, and we are going to put an end to Judge Josiah Hensley, once and for all." Gideon stood up. He walked to the gun rack on the wall, took down his Sharps rifle, and began to clean it with slow, careful hands. Elijah moved closer to Cora and laid one of his warm, broad palms gently over her smaller hand. "You are not alone anymore," he said softly. She broke. Whatever last thread of strength she had been holding inside her finally gave way, and she put her face in her hands, and she wept. She wept the way a small child weeps when it has been frightened for too long. She wept in great heaving sobs that shook her whole body beneath the wool blanket. And none of us spoke. We simply let her cry. Because some things, gentlemen, some things have to come out before a soul can heal. Outside, the wind shrieked across the high peaks. The fire popped and hissed in the stone hearth. And in the warm, flickering light of our cabin on Black Bear Pass, 3 broken brothers and 1 shattered young woman sat together in the silence after the weeping, and a thing none of us had a name for began very slowly to take root. It was perhaps an hour later when the storm had reached its full fury, and Cora had fallen into an exhausted sleep on the bearskin rug with her dark hair spread out around her like spilled ink, that I stepped onto the front porch with Gideon to look at the sky. The wind tore at our coats. The snow whipped sideways across the planks. The temperature had to be 10 below zero by then and falling. Gideon did not look at me. He looked out into the white, howling dark. "Brother," he said, "you know what we have promised her." "I know." "You know what it means." "I know what it means." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Hannah would be proud of you tonight." I did not answer him. I could not. We stood there together for a long time, two brothers on a porch in the middle of the worst blizzard the San Juans had seen in 20 years, looking out at a white wall of weather, behind which lay a town, and a man and an evil that we were now bound by every promise we had ever made to destroy. Inside the cabin, Cora Mae Whitfield slept for the first time in 3 weeks, without fear. The fire burned low. Elijah sat beside her with a book of Tennyson open in his lap, reading silently, his face calm and watchful as a sentry on a quiet wall. The wind howled, the snow fell, and somewhere down in Silverton, in a fine 3-story house that he believed he owned, the way a man owns a horse, Judge Josiah Hensley sat by his own fire, sipping his evening brandy, entirely unaware that 3 mountain men he had never bothered to think about had just made him the most wanted dead man in the territory of Colorado. Morning came to the San Juans the way it always comes after a great storm. The wind died sometime in the smallest hours of the night, and when the gray light began to seep through the frost-laced glass of our cabin window, it found a world that had been buried alive. 4 feet of fresh powder lay across every surface. The pines bent low under their white burdens. The thermometer on the porch post read 18 below zero. Smoke from our chimney rose straight up into the still cold air, a single thin column climbing toward a sky the color of old pewter. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to a bed of red coals. Elijah sat where I had left him, the book of Tennyson still open in his lap, his head tipped slightly back against the wall, in a sleep so light it would have woken at the sound of a mouse crossing the floor. On the bearskin rug, Cora Mae Whitfield lay curled beneath 2 heavy wool blankets. Her dark hair spread across the pillow Elijah had fetched for her from his own bunk. Her breathing slow and even for the first time in 3 weeks. I stood at the window for a long while, looking out at the buried world, thinking. A man who has been a soldier learns sooner or later that promises made in the heat of feeling are the most dangerous promises a man can make. The night before, in the firelight and the storm and the broken weeping of a young woman who had been used like a piece of property, I had promised her 3 things. I had promised her safety. I had promised her my brothers and myself. And I had promised her the death of Judge Josiah Hensley. The first 2 I could keep with the strength of my own hands. The third one, gentlemen, the third one was going to take a great deal more than strength. Gideon came down from the loft just after dawn. He moved to the hearth, raked the coals together, laid on 3 fresh logs, and stood watching the small flames climb the bark. He did not speak. None of us spoke. There is a kind of silence that brothers share before a hard day's work, and we 3 had been sharing it for 14 years. Elijah stirred. His eyes opened. He looked at Cora, still sleeping, and a soft, sad smile touched the corners of his mouth. Then he rose without a sound and joined us at the table on the far side of the cabin, where we could speak in low voices without waking her. "How is she?" I asked him. "She slept the whole night through," he said. "No fever. The bruises will fade. The marks on her wrists, those will need ointment and clean linen for several days. The burn on her collarbone will scar, but it will heal. As for the rest of it..." He stopped. He looked down at his hands. Elijah was the gentlest of us three, and there were things he could not bring himself to say out loud. As for the rest of it, he finished quietly, that will take longer than any winter. Gideon set down the iron poker. His green eyes were hard. "What is the plan, brother?" he said to me. I had been turning it over in my head all night, between fitful patches of sleep and the long hours when I had simply lain awake listening to the storm. I had reached only one conclusion. Before any plan could be made, I had to know the shape of the enemy. I had to know what Hensley believed. I had to know what he intended. I had to know who he had already telegraphed and what kind of forces he was about to bring against us. "I am riding to Silverton," I said. "Today." Elijah's head came up sharply. "The trails will not be safe for another 2 days," he said. "The drifts must be 10 feet deep on the north faces. Brother, you cannot. The trails will be exactly as safe today as they will be 3 days from now," I said. "And every hour we sit in this cabin is an hour Hensley uses to organize his pursuit. I will not give him that hour." Gideon nodded once. He understood. He had always understood. "I will take old Buck," I said. "He has more sense in the snow than the other 2 horses combined. I will be down in town by noon. I will be back by nightfall. Weather willing." "You will be back by nightfall," Gideon said. "Weather willing or not." I almost smiled. He has always been the one who said out loud the things I would not. Cora woke just after we had finished the small breakfast Elijah had cooked fried trout from the cold pantry sourdough biscuits. Hot coffee. She woke slowly the way a frightened animal wakes in a strange den. Her eyes opening first, her body very still, only gradually allowing herself to sit up when she had remembered where she was and who she was with. She wore one of my old flannel shirts, far too large for her, the cuffs rolled up over her thin wrists. Beneath it she had on a pair of Elijah's wool drawers gathered at the waist with a length of rawhide. We had no women's clothing in the cabin. We never had. She accepted the plate of food Elijah handed her without speaking. She ate with the careful, slow hunger of someone who had not been allowed to eat enough for a long time. Watching her, I felt that cold, ugly thing turn over in my chest again, and I had to look away. When she had finished, I sat down across from her at the table and laid my hands flat on the wood. "Miss Whitfield," I said. "Cora," she answered. "Please. After last night, please call me Cora." "Cora," I said, "today I am riding down to Silverton. I need to know what your judge has done, what he believes, and what kind of men he has called to find you. I will be gone all day. While I am gone, my brothers will be with you here, and I want you to do exactly what they say, without question. Will you do that?" She nodded. "There is one more thing," I said. "Did anyone see you climb into our wagon yesterday afternoon? Anyone at all?" She thought carefully. I waited. After 3 weeks of being given no time to think for herself, the simple act of being asked a question and being given the silence in which to answer it seemed to take her an extra moment. "No," she said finally. "Hensley left the house at 1 o'clock to meet with Sheriff Blackburn at the saloon. He had told me the night before that I was not to leave the house. The locks on the doors are kept on the outside, but he had left the cellar door unbolted because the cook was due to come in for the meat order. I waited until the cook had finished and gone. Then I slipped out through the cellar. I crossed the alley behind the house and went into the livery stable that belongs to Mr. Abernathy. She paused. "I know that stable," I said. "Go on." I hid in the loft for almost 2 hours. I was so cold by then that I could barely feel my hands. When I saw your wagon outside the mercantile, when I heard the 3 of you go inside the store, I climbed down. I crawled under the canvas tarp from the back. The mercantile boy was loading the last of the sacks for someone else's order. He did not look around. I do not believe he saw me. "So Hensley does not know," Gideon said softly. "Or he believes I am dead in the storm," Cora said. I had no coat. The sheriff knew that. By the time the storm hit, anyone would have assumed I was buried in a drift somewhere outside the town limits. I sat back. That at least was a small mercy. If Hensley believed she had wandered off and frozen, his search would be limited to the immediate vicinity of Silverton. If he believed she had been stolen, his search would have no limits at all. I would know which one it was within the next 6 hours. I rode out at 7:30 that morning. Old Buck was a sturdy bay gelding with a gray muzzle and the patience of an Old Testament prophet, and he picked his way down the long buried switchbacks of Black Bear Pass with the kind of careful instinct that only mountain horses ever develop. By 11:30, I had reached the timberline. By 1:15 I had tied him in a stand of scrub oak a mile north of Silverton, covered him with a wool saddle blanket against the cold, and set out on foot through the deep snow toward the back lots of the town. I did not enter Silverton through the main road. I came in through a narrow alley behind the boarding house where the snow had been beaten down by the boots of half the town's bachelors, and I kept my collar pulled high and my hat brim pulled low. I needed to listen first. I needed to hear what the town was saying before any man recognized me. I heard plenty. Inside the Silver Spur Saloon, where I drifted like any cold miner looking for a noon whiskey, the talk was of nothing else. Judge Hensley's young Boston bride had vanished sometime the previous afternoon. Foul play was suspected. The judge himself had appeared on the steps of the courthouse at first light, that morning, his face a mask of grief, and had announced to the gathering townspeople that his beloved fiancée, his sweet, pure Cora May, had been taken by force from his very home by mountain heathens of the worst description. $5,000, the bartender was telling a wide-eyed prospector at the rail. $5,000 to any man who brings information leading to her recovery, and $10,000 to the man who returns her to the judge alive and unharmed. $10,000 in 1883 was the kind of money that would have bought a working ranch with cattle to stock it. Every desperate man within 200 miles would soon be combing the hills. But that gentleman, that was not the worst of it. I drained my whiskey, paid in coin, and walked out into the cold. I crossed the street to the assayer's office, then doubled back through an alley toward the side door of the county recorder's office. The wind had begun to pick up again, and most of the town was inside out of the cold. I had perhaps 20 minutes before someone began to wonder why a tall, bearded stranger in a buffalo hide coat was standing too long in any one spot. The county recorder was a man named Howard Tate. He was perhaps 60 years old, a thin, wattled man with watery eyes and a flask he kept in the lower drawer of his desk, and he was almost always asleep by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I had counted on it. When I pushed open the heavy oak door, Tate was slumped in his chair, with his chin on his chest, snoring softly, an empty tin cup beside his blotter. I moved silently. I had learned silence in the war. I crossed to the cabinet that held the property files and the marriage records, and I began to search. I found Margaret Hensley's file in less than 5 minutes. What I read there made the cold thing in my chest grow colder still. Margaret Hensley, formerly. Margaret Lassiter had married Josiah Hensley in the spring of 1875. She had brought into the marriage a small but genuine fortune. Her father, an Englishman who had come west in the early days of the silver rush, had died and left her the sole owner of the Lucky Star mine, a working silver claim in the high country northwest of Silverton. The Lucky Star, according to the assayer's records pinned to the inside of the file folder, had been worth at the time of Margaret's death in September of 1881 an estimated $1.5 million. Margaret had died, the death certificate said, of a sudden fever. She had died childless. Under the laws of the territory, every penny of the Lucky Star mine had passed on the day of her funeral to her grieving husband. I sat back on my heels in front of the open cabinet. The shape of the man came clear in my mind. Hensley was not simply a brutal man. He was not simply a perverse one. He was a hunter of heiresses. He was a patient and methodical predator who had learned at some point in his earlier life that the law in a frontier territory was a perfectly serviceable tool for legal murder if a man knew how to use it. But why Cora? Cora had no fortune. Cora was the daughter of a poor Boston widow and a stepfather who had spent his last dollar at the gambling tables. Cora was by every appearance a girl with nothing to her name but the dress she had been wearing when she stepped off the train. Why would a man like Hensley spend $800 on a wife who had nothing? Unless... I went back to the cabinet. I dug deeper. In the bottom drawer behind a stack of old land patents, I found what I was looking for. A folded telegram dated the 5th of November of that year, sent from Boston, addressed to Judge Josiah Hensley, Silverton, Colorado Territory. I unfolded it with cold fingers. I read. The contents of that telegram, gentlemen, struck me harder than any blow I had ever taken in any saloon. Hensley. Arrangement complete. Girl arrives Silverton on November 8th. Following marriage ceremony Christmas Day, Whitfield Silver Mine in Leadville District will pass to bride per terms of mother's will. Bride remains unaware of inheritance. Recommend you keep her ignorant until ceremony concluded. Regards, Barnaby Stone. I read it twice, then a third time. The Whitfield Silver Mine. I knew of the Whitfield Mine the way every man in the Colorado mining country knew of it. It sat in the Leadville District 200 miles to the north, and it was one of the richest silver veins ever struck in the state. The original owner, an industrialist named Cornelius Whitfield, who had died many years before, had left a complicated estate. I had never paid much attention to the rumors, but in that quiet office with Howard Tate snoring softly behind me, and the wind beginning to rise outside, the entire shape of the conspiracy came clear. Cora's mother had been a Whitfield. The mine had been her inheritance. When she had died when Cora was 12 years old, the property had passed into a trust to be held until Cora's 21st birthday. Barnaby Stone, her stepfather, had been named the temporary administrator of that trust. He had hidden its existence from Cora her entire life. He had told her year after year that her mother had left her nothing but a silver crucifix and $50 in a tin box. And now, with Cora about to turn 21 and the trust about to dissolve in her favor, Stone had found a buyer. He had sold her for $800 and a 20% share of the mine to a man whose specialty was the legal murder of wealthy young wives. The Whitfield silver mine, by the assayer's most recent estimate, was worth $1,200,000. I folded the telegram. I slipped it inside my coat. I closed the cabinet drawer, and as I rose to my feet and turned toward the door, Howard Tate snorted, jerked, and woke up. His watery eyes focused on me. They went wide. "You," he gasped. You are Silas Rourke." He stumbled backward out of his chair, knocking over the tin cup, knocking over the brass spittoon by his desk. And he was halfway to the front door of the office shouting for help. Before I could close the distance between us, I caught him by the collar in the doorway. I shoved him hard enough to send him sprawling across his own desk. But the damage had been done. His shouts had carried across the street. From the saloon, I could already hear the heavy boots of men beginning to run. I went out the back. The alley behind the recorder's office was narrow and choked with frozen drifts. I pushed through them at a hard run. My breath ragged in the bitter air. The telegram inside my coat. The most valuable piece of paper I'd ever carried. I cleared the back of the building. I cut left through a gap between the bank and a feed store. I came out on the side street that led north toward the livery and the trail home. A man in a long gray winter coat stepped out from behind the corner of the bank. He was perhaps 40 years old, tall, lean. He wore a flat-brimmed black hat low on his brow, and beneath it I could see a face that had been hardened by years of doing exactly the kind of work he was about to do. A black patch covered his left eye. In his right hand, leveled steady at the center of my chest, was a Smith & Wesson revolver. The man with him, the second gray coat coming around from the other side of the bank, had a Winchester carbine. "You will be Mr. Rourke," the one-eyed man said. His voice was calm, almost pleasant. The voice of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything a long time ago. "My name is Augustus Thorne," he said. "I represent the Thorne Detective Agency out of Denver. The judge has hired my associates and myself for the task of locating his missing fiancée. Now I am going to ask you, Mr. Rourke, very politely to drop your weapons and to come quietly. There is a great deal of money on your head, and I would very much prefer to collect it without putting a hole in you first." I drew faster than he expected. My hand had been resting on the butt of the Colt at my hip from the moment I had stepped out of Tate's office, and I came up with it shooting the way a man learns to shoot when he has spent 4 years shooting for his life on a battlefield. My first round took the second detective high in the shoulder. He spun like a top and went down in the snow. My second round was meant for Thorne, but the one-eyed man was already moving sideways, dropping into a crouch behind the corner of the bank, and his own bullet whined past my left ear, close enough that I felt the heat of it on my cheek. I did not stay to finish the fight. I turned and ran. Behind me, I heard Thorne shout an order to someone I had not seen. I heard boots crunching at a hard run through the deep snow. I heard a third man shouting for the sheriff. A bullet tore through the heavy buffalo hide of my coat and laid open a long, shallow gash along my left ribs. I did not stop. I cleared the corner of the feed store. I cleared the back fence of the lumber yard. I made the timber line at a dead run with my breath coming in ragged gasps and the warm, wet sliding of blood soaking through my flannel shirt. Old Buck was where I had left him. I tore the saddle blanket off him, threw myself onto his back, and put my heels to his sides. Harder than I had ever asked anything of that good, honest horse. He responded the way mountain horses respond when their rider's life depends on it. We went up that mountain like the devil himself was riding behind us, and somewhere in my mind, gentlemen, somewhere in my mind I think the devil was. The sun had dropped behind the western peaks by the time the cabin came into sight. I was swaying in the saddle by then. The cut along my ribs had not been deep, but it had been bleeding steady for almost 4 hours, and the cold and the hard riding had taken a great deal out of me. I saw the cabin door open before I had even crossed the last clearing. Gideon had been watching the trail through the brass spyglass. He came running across the snow with his rifle in his hand. "Brother," he shouted, "you are hit." "A graze," I told him. "I have had worse from a kick stirrup." He caught Old Buck's bridle. He helped me down. I nearly fell. He half carried me toward the cabin door, and at the door Cora was standing, her face white with fear, her green eyes huge. Inside, she did something none of us had expected. She moved. She moved with the quick, certain hands of a woman who had done this kind of work before. She had me out of my buffalo hide coat and my flannel shirt before I had managed to sit down at the table. She had a kettle of hot water on the hearth and a bottle of whiskey from the sideboard and a clean linen sheet from the cedar chest. She had Elijah running for his medical kit. She had Gideon stoking the fire higher. I had not known, gentlemen, that her mother had been a trained nurse. Cora explained it to me later that evening, sitting by the fire, with her hands still smelling of yarrow and whiskey. Her mother had been born a Whitfield, the only daughter of a wealthy industrialist family. But she had broken with her father over his determination to marry her to a railroad heir she did not love. She had run away from the family estate at the age of 19, taken a position as a charity nurse at a Boston hospital, and never spoken to her father again. The old man had died believing she had vanished forever. He had never known about the daughter she had borne, never known about Cora May. The Whitfield mine had passed into trust because no one in the family knew there was an heir to receive it directly. Cora had grown up watching her mother dress wounds and brew fevers down in the women's ward of Boston Charity Hospital, and she had learned by quiet observation what every nurse's daughter learns: how to clean a knife wound, how to set a stitch, how to keep her hands steady when a man was bleeding into her lap. She cleaned the wound with whiskey. She dressed it with a poultice of yarrow leaves and crushed willow bark from Elijah's stores. She stitched the deepest part of it with a curved needle and a length of thin sinew, her small fingers moving with a steady precision that surprised even her. When she pressed her palm flat against my chest to hold the bandage in place while she tied it off, neither one of us spoke. But I felt the warmth of her hand through the thin cotton of the bandage, and I felt the slow, careful rhythm of her breathing. And I knew, gentlemen, I knew right then that something had changed in me that I had believed could never change again. When she was done, when the bandage was tied and the bloody linen was set aside, she sat back on her heels in front of the chair where I was slumped. She looked up at me. Her green eyes searched my face. "You should not have gone," she said softly. "I had to know," I told her. She nodded. She understood. Of course she understood. She more than anyone knew what kind of man we were dealing with. I pulled the folded telegram from inside my coat. I laid it on the table. "Cora," I said, "there is something you do not know about your mother. Something that explains everything that has happened to you." She picked up the paper. She unfolded it. She read. I watched her face as she read. I watched the slow understanding move across her features. I watched her lips part. I watched her hand begin to tremble. By the time she reached the bottom of the telegram, the trembling had become a violent shake, and she had to set the paper down on the table because her fingers would no longer hold it. "The Whitfield silver mine," she whispered. "It was your mother's," I said. "It is yours, or it will be on Christmas Day." She put both hands flat on the table to steady herself. Her dark hair had fallen forward across her shoulders. Her face had gone the color of bone. "He told me she left me nothing," she said. "My stepfather. He told me. He told me. For 9 years he told me. He let me wear the same 2 dresses. He let me work as a seamstress to pay the rent. He told me my mother had loved me, but that there had been no money. There had been no money. He sold my dresses to pay his gambling debts, Mr. Rourke. And the whole time I said quietly, 'You are the heir to one of the richest silver mines in Colorado.'" Gideon had been standing by the hearth. He spoke now, his voice tight with the controlled anger I had come to know in him. "He sold you to Hensley because he could not touch the mine himself," he said. "The trust dissolved on your 21st birthday. He could not steal from you directly. So he sold you to a man who specializes in marrying wealthy young women and burying them within the year." Cora stared at the telegram on the table. A single tear ran down her cheek and fell on the paper. "Margaret Hensley," she whispered. "I am Margaret Hensley. You are not," Elijah said gently. He came to her side. He laid one of his broad, warm hands over both of hers. You will not be. You will never be. Do you hear me, Cora? You will never be Margaret Hensley. She looked up at him. Her green eyes were full of tears. But behind the tears, gentlemen, behind the tears, something new had begun to burn. Something that had not been there in the broken, weeping girl of the night before. Something hard. Something steady. I will not, she said. I swear before God I will not. I will fight him. I will fight him with whatever you three will teach me, and I will not be Margaret Hensley. I looked at her and I looked at my brothers, and I understood that the woman who had crawled half dead out of the back of our wagon 18 hours before was already slowly becoming someone else. The next 2 weeks changed all 4 of us. I will not pretend, gentlemen, that those weeks were easy, or that the wounds of 3 broken men and 1 shattered girl healed cleanly. They did not. But work has a way of making a body forget its sorrows, and we set ourselves to work. Elijah took on the task of mending Cora's body and her spirit. He taught her about the herbs that grew in the high country mountain mint and wild yarrow, and the inner bark of the slippery elm. He taught her how to mix poultices and tinctures from the small store of medicines he had gathered over the years. In the evenings he read to her by the fire Charles Dickens and Mark Twain and Tennyson and Longfellow, and the soft rumble of his voice and the warm yellow light of the lamp built between them. A quiet kinship that was as gentle as anything I had ever seen in this world. He became in those 2 weeks the brother she had never had. Gideon took on the harder work. He taught her to shoot. He started her with the small Colt I had given her on the first morning, taught her the proper grip, the proper stance, the slow breath out before the squeeze of the trigger. By the end of the first week, she could put 3 rounds out of 6 into a tin can at 20 paces. By the end of the second week, she could hit a pine cone at 50. He taught her the Winchester next, and he showed her how to load it, how to clear a jam, how to fire it from the saddle. And he gave her finally a matched pair of small 2-shot Derringers, pearl-handled, and silver chased the kind of weapons a riverboat gambler used to carry as his last word in an argument. Gideon had bought them years before in a card game in Dodge City, and he had never had occasion to use them. He showed her how to hide one inside the bodice of a dress where no man would think to look, and he showed her how to sew a second hidden pocket into the inner lining of a heavy coat against the day when the first one might fail her. Carry both, my brother told her, always both. A man searches once, never twice. Those last 2 weapons, gentlemen, those last 2 weapons would matter more than any of us yet knew. And I taught her to ride, truly to ride. Not the genteel side-saddle posting of a Boston lady on a park path, but the hard western seat that a person needs to survive in the high country. We worked in the snow-packed yard behind the cabin, and on the lower trails when the weather allowed, and Cora took to it the way a fish takes to a clean stream. She had no fear in the saddle. The horse Gideon had chosen for her was a solid black mountain mare he had named Midnight, and within a week the 2 of them moved together, as if they had always belonged to one another. It was during those riding lessons that something began to happen between Cora and me that I had not been expecting. She fell from the saddle on the third morning. The mare had spooked at a snowshoe hare bursting from a thicket, and Cora had not been ready, and she had gone over the side and landed hard in a deep drift. I dismounted at a run. I reached her before she had finished sitting up. I crouched beside her, my hands on her shoulders, my face close to hers, and I asked her if she was hurt. She looked up at me. The cold had brought color into her cheeks. Snow clung to her dark hair. Her green eyes met mine, and the question I had asked her hung in the cold, still air between us, and neither of us moved. "I am not hurt," she said softly, but neither of us let go for a long moment. And when I finally helped her to her feet, my hand lingered on her elbow longer than it had any right to, and her hand brushed mine as she reached up to push the snow from her hair, and I felt something move in my chest that I had buried in Wyoming 5 years before. I turned away. I told myself I was a fool. I told myself I was old enough to be her father. I told myself that the dead deserved more loyalty than this. And that night, sitting alone on the porch in the cold, while my brothers slept, I let myself for the first time say her name out loud. "Hannah." I whispered to the dark. "Hannah, what should a man do?" The wind in the pines did not answer me, but the wind in the pines never does. It was on the 11th day after Cora had come to us that we learned how close the world had come to our cabin. A trapper named Old Pete came riding up the trail at mid-morning with a load of beaver pelts to sell. He was a friend of mine, a leathery, weather-beaten old man of perhaps 70 years who had been trapping the high country since before the war. He sat down at our table and drank a cup of hot coffee with hands that had only 9 fingers on them. And when Elijah had set the pelts to count in the side room, Old Pete leaned across the table and lowered his voice. "Silas," he said, "there is a man asking after you in Silverton." I waited. I did not speak. "A man with a black eye patch," Old Pete said, "wearing one of those long gray winter coats. Goes by the name of Thorn. He has been buying drinks for every trapper, every prospector, every cowpoke in the territory. $200 in coin to any man who will guide him to your cabin. I would not take his money, of course, nor would Hank Polson, nor would the Sutter brothers. But there are others, Silas. There are others. A trapper from over by the Dolores, a man named Jed Carter, was sitting at Thorne's table when I came through 3 days ago. He had the look of a man who would take that money." "He has," I said quietly. I felt it. Old Pete's eyes met mine. "How many men does Thorne have?" I asked. 8, Old Pete said. "All of them in those gray coats. All of them carrying the kind of iron a man does not carry unless he means to use it." I nodded slowly. I thanked him. He took his payment for the pelts in hard coin the way he always did, and he rode out before noon. I watched him until his horse vanished down the long bend of the trail, and then I turned and went back inside the cabin to call my brothers and Cora to the table. "We are going to have visitors," I said. and we are going to be ready for them. We were ready when they came. They came on the night of the 12th day, which was the 3rd of December, by the calendar nailed to the wall. Thorn had thought himself clever. He had brought his men up the back trail in the small hours of the morning just before 3 o'clock, when he believed the household would be at its deepest sleep. He had spread them in a half circle around the cabin, 2 flanking from the north and the south, the rest creeping in from the front. He did not know about the wire. I had strung a single thin steel wire in a great loose loop 200 yards out from the cabin, threaded through the lower branches of the surrounding pines, and at half a dozen points along its length, I had attached small brass sleigh bells from a pack I had taken off a horse thief in 1878. The wire lay buried beneath 6 inches of fresh snow. No man walking in the dark could see it, but any man who put his boot on it or any man who stumbled into a branch where it ran would set the whole circle ringing. Gideon was on the 2nd watch that night. He was sitting in the loft with his sharps across his knees, looking out at the moonlight on the snow when the bells began to ring. What happened next happened fast. Gideon dropped 2 of them at 150 yards before they had finished their first volley. The Sharps was a long-range rifle slow to reload, but accurate to a quarter mile in good hands, and Gideon's hands were among the best in the Rocky Mountains. Elijah took up his position at the east window with a double-barreled coach gun loaded with buckshot, and when one of the gray coats came up through the brush, within 20 yards he let him have both barrels at once. The man went down in the snow and did not move again. I held the south side. The man who came at me through the trees took my round through the throat at 30 paces, but it was Cora Gentleman. Cora. She had taken the west window. She had her Winchester. And when a 4th detective came running up from that direction, breaking through the drifts with his pistol drawn, she fired. Her first round hit him in the leg. He went down screaming. He raised his pistol toward her window. Her second round hit him in the chest. He dropped his weapon. He fell forward into the snow. She did not flinch. She did not weep. She simply lowered the rifle from her shoulder and looked across the cabin at me, and her green eyes were very bright and very steady. "Did I do right?" she said. "You did right," I told her. The fight lasted 25 minutes in all. Thorn lost 4 men dead. He took a bullet of his own through the meat of his right thigh. He and his 3 surviving detectives retreated back down the mountain through the deep snow, and I let them go because chasing wounded men through the dark was not work I had any taste for. When dawn came, we counted the bodies. 4 men in the gray coats of the Thorn Detective Agency. We dug a single deep pit in the frozen earth at the edge of our claim, and we put them in it with no markers. The mountain itself would be their grave. 2 days later, the second telegram came. A trapper we did not know brought it up the trail, paid to deliver it by some unknown hand in Silverton. Gideon read it first. Then I read it. Then I crumpled it in my fist and held it over the fire. It was from Hensley. I will not give you the whole of it, gentlemen. The judge had taken the time to research the 3 of us, and he had researched us thoroughly. He knew about Hannah and Ruth. He knew about the killings I had done in Wyoming. He knew about Gideon's arrest warrant in Kansas. He knew about Elijah's troubles at Yale. And he was offering in the cool, measured language of a man playing chess to bury all of it, to make every charge disappear, to set the three of us free to live our lives in peace. In exchange for the return of Cora Mae Whitfield by the midnight of Christmas Eve. I burned the telegram. But that night on the porch, Gideon came out to stand beside me in the cold. "Brother," he said, "there is something I never told you." I looked at him. The moon was high and white over the peaks. His face in the moonlight was the face of a man who had been carrying a heavy stone for a very long time. "When Hannah and Ruth were taken," he said, "when you went hunting for those men, I went looking too. I went my own way. I picked up a different trail than the one you followed. I waited. I found out who paid them, brother," he said. "I found out who hired the band that took your wife and your daughter. It was not a private feud. It was not a random raid. It was a contract killing. The cold thing in my chest, the thing that had slept for 5 years, came fully awake. A judge in Wyoming," Gideon said. "A man named Cornelius Hensley." I did not move. I did not speak. I stared out at the moonlight. Hannah had seen something Gideon said quietly a few months before she was killed. She had witnessed Cornelius Hensley taking a bribe in a land dispute. She wrote a letter to a lawyer in Denver. She intended to testify. Cornelius could not allow that. "So Cornelius hired the band that came to your ranch." I closed my eyes. "Cornelius Hensley died of a stroke in 1880. Gideon went on. 2 years after Hannah, the official record says a stroke. There were those who said his own brother, his own younger brother in Silverton, had a hand in shutting his mouth before he could turn evidence." "Josiah," I whispered. "Josiah Hensley," Gideon said. "The same man who is sitting in his fine house tonight, planning the murder of the girl asleep inside our cabin. The same man who put 8 bullets through the doorframe of this place 2 nights ago. He is not just her enemy, brother. He is ours. He is the brother of the man who took your wife and your child from you." I stood there a long time. The cold tightened around me like an iron band. Far below us in the dark valley, a single small light burned in a window of a fine 3-story house in Silverton, where a man sat by his own fire and did not yet know that the past had finally caught up with him. 5 days, Gideon said softly beside me. 5 days until Christmas Eve. 5 days, I answered. We turned together and went back inside the warm cabin. The fire still burned. Cora was asleep on the bearskin rug with one of the small derringers Gideon had given her, tucked beneath her pillow, and her dark hair spread out around her like spilled ink. And her face in sleep was the face of a young woman who had begun slowly to remember how to dream. I stood over her for a long moment. Then I leaned down, and I drew the wool blanket up over her shoulders, and I bent, and I kissed the top of her head once lightly, the way a man kisses something he has been given, that he does not deserve. She did not wake. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again. Down in the valley, a clock tower in Silverton began to strike the hour of midnight 12, slow brass strokes carrying up the mountain on the cold, still air. 5 days. The night of Christmas Eve in 1883 came to the San Juan Mountains with a strange, unnatural stillness. The wind had died at sundown. The clouds had thinned to the color of old pewter. A great pale moon, swollen and watchful, hung above the peaks like the eye of a god who had decided after long consideration to stay awake for what was about to happen below. We rode out the cabin at 10:30 in the evening. Cora was no longer the girl we had carried half dead from the back of a wagon 5 weeks before. She wore deerskin breeches that Gideon had cut down for her from his own spares, and a heavy wool sheepskin coat that Elijah had traded an old trapper for during the second week. Her dark hair was braided in a single thick rope down her back. On her right hip rode the small colt I had given her on the first morning. In her saddle scabbard lay the Winchester Gideon had taught her to shoot. And tucked deep inside the bodice of her undershirt, warm against her skin, rode one of the matched derringers, while the second lay hidden in the inner pocket she had sewn herself into the lining of her sheepskin coat. She rode midnight at my left flank. Gideon rode point on his big sorrel. Elijah brought up the rear with his small wagon of carefully wrapped supplies. We did not take the main road. The main road would have been watched by half the territory by then, and the bounty on my head and on the heads of my brothers had risen to the kind of figure that would draw out every desperate man with a rifle from Durango to Leadville. Instead, we took an old Ute trail that I had ridden 3 times in the years since we built the cabin, a thin, twisting line that climbed the eastern face of Black Bear Pass before dropping down through a hidden box canyon into the back end of Silverton. The snow was crusted hard from the long, cold spell. The horses moved well over it. We did not speak for the first hour. There was nothing to say that we had not already said 100 times around the cabin table over the previous 5 days. And there is a kind of silence that comes over fighting men in the hours before a fight. That has nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the careful conservation of the soul. I kept looking at her. I could not help myself. 5 weeks before, she had been a porcelain doll with bruises beneath her sleeves. 5 weeks before, she had wept herself to sleep on a bearskin rug with no name in her mouth except the names of the dead. Now she rode beside me through the cold moonlight with her green eyes steady and her small jaw set and her gloved hand resting easy on the reins. And the woman I saw on Midnight's back was a woman who had decided somewhere in the long, quiet evenings of December that she would not run anymore. We crested the saddle of Black Bear Pass at 11:30. We picked our way down the backside single file, our horses stepping carefully through the deep drifts that the wind had piled against the lee of the cliffs. By midnight, we had reached the timberline. By 5:30, we had tied our animals in a small clearing of scrub oak 1/4 mile north of the town's edge, and we had blanketed them against the cold, and we had begun the last walk in on foot. Silverton on Christmas Eve was a quieter town than I had ever seen it. The miners had gone home for the holiday or had drunk themselves into stupors, or had gone to the small Catholic mission at the south end of Reese Street to listen to the priest sing a midnight mass in Latin Most of the windows were dark. Smoke curled from a few chimneys. A single dog barked somewhere off behind the livery and then fell silent. But one house was lit. The judge's house was a tall 3-story affair of milled timber and quarried stone. The largest private residence in Silverton, sitting on a small rise at the south end of Green Street. Every window of every floor was bright with lamplight. A wreath of evergreen and red ribbon hung on the heavy front door. Through the tall front parlor windows I could see the shadow of a great Christmas tree, decked in silver tinsel, and small white candles, its top brushing the parlor ceiling. From inside the house, faint but clear in the still air, came the sound of a piano. The judge was playing Silent Night. Cora stood beside me in the shadow of the alley across the street, and she stared at that lit house for a long moment without moving. "He always plays the piano on Christmas Eve," she said quietly. "Every Christmas Eve, all alone in that big parlor. He plays Silent Night and Adeste Fidelis and Hark the Herald Angels Sing, to convince himself that he is a good man, to convince himself that he is not what he is." I touched her elbow. "Are you ready?" I asked her. She nodded once. Her jaw was tight. Her green eyes were fixed on the lit windows of that house with a clarity I had seen in good soldiers in the moments before they went over the wall. We split into our positions then. Gideon took the long sharps and slipped away through the alleys toward the back of the post office. From the roof of that building 2 stories tall, he would have a clear line of fire at the front porch and the upstairs windows of the judge's house. Elijah took the small wagon and the cloth-wrapped bundles of dynamite and slow fuse. He would set his charges at 2 locations. The first was the timber-framed sheriff's office on Reese Street 3 blocks south. The second was a faint and empty tool shed behind the assayer's office set to give the impression of further trouble at the north end of town. Elijah's job was misdirection. If the night went well, those charges would never need to be lit. If the night went badly, they would be the only thing that bought us the time to escape. That left me and Cora and the cellar door at the back of the judge's house. She knew the way better than I did. She led me. We moved through the alley behind the bank across a small frozen stable yard, through a gap in a board fence, and along the side of the judge's property. We crouched at the rear corner. Cora pointed silently to a low slanted door set into the base of the foundation. The cellar door. The same door she had crawled out of 5 weeks before with no coat and no plan, and no hope but the hope of dying in the snow before he could get her again. I worked the latch with my knife. The lock was the same simple iron hasp it had been the day she escaped. He had not changed it. Perhaps he had not believed in his arrogance that anyone would be foolish enough to try the same way twice. The cellar smelled of cold earth and stored apples, and a faint, sour breath of old wine. We crossed it in the dark. Cora found the wooden stairs by memory. We climbed them, my left hand resting lightly on the small of her back to steady her. My right hand wrapped around the butt of the Colt at my hip. The kitchen at the top of the cellar stairs was empty. The iron stove had been banked for the night. A single lamp burned low on the long pine table. From the parlor, 2 rooms away, The music of the piano drifted clear and sweet. Silent night. Holy night. We crossed the kitchen. We entered the dining room. We came to the open archway of the parlor. Judge Josiah Hensley sat at the polished black upright piano with his back to us. He wore a deep crimson velvet smoking jacket over a white linen shirt, and his iron gray hair gleamed in the candlelight from the great Christmas tree. His long hands moved over the keys with the practiced grace of a man who had been playing the piano since he was 7 years old. On a small mahogany side table beside him sat a glass of brandy and a folded newspaper. He did not turn around when we entered the room, but the music stopped. His hands rose from the keys, hung motionless above them for the length of a heartbeat, and then settled gently on his knees. "Cora May," he said. His voice was perfectly calm. "And I would venture to guess, Mr. Silas Rourke, welcome to my home. Please, come in." I leveled the Colt at the back of his head. "Get on your knees," I told him. He turned slowly on the piano bench. He turned the way a man turns to greet expected guests. His face was composed. His pale gray eyes had that strange amused light in them that I have seen since only in the eyes of 2 other men in my life. And both of those men were hanged for the things they had done. He looked at me. He looked at Cora. He smiled. "Mr. Rourke," he said, "I have been expecting you." The doors behind us slammed open. 6 men in long gray winter coats came into the parlor through 3 different entrances. The front hall, the dining room behind us, and the side door from the rear stair. They were the survivors of Thorne's original company. The 3 who had ridden away from our cabin alive, plus 3 new hands the judge had paid premium wages to bring up by special train from Denver in the days that followed. Every one of them carried a rifle or a revolver. The leader, the man with the black eye patch and the hard, tight smile, stepped into the parlor at the head of the front hall group. His right thigh was bandaged thick beneath his trouser leg. He limped. "It is good to see you again." "Mr. Rourke," said Augustus Thorne, "I do hope you have not been too inconvenienced by my recovery." Cora's hand went to her hip without thinking. I caught her wrist. "Not yet," I murmured. Hensley rose from the piano bench. He smoothed the front of his velvet jacket with both hands. He walked slowly toward us between the candle-lit Christmas tree and the warm hearth of his fine parlor. And he stopped 6 feet away. "Mr. Rourke," he said, "drop the gun, or my associates will fire. Cora May will not be harmed in the exchange. I have given Mr. Thorne very specific instructions on that point. But you and your brothers, I am afraid, will be remembered in Silverton as the heathen kidnappers who died in the very act of their final outrage upon a respectable young bride-to-be. The newspapers will be kind to me. They always are." He smiled again, the smile of a man who has already won. "You are very quiet, Mr. Rourke," he said. I had expected more bluster. I called out in a voice loud enough to carry through every door of that house. "Gideon." There was no shot from the post office roof. There was no answering rifle round. There was nothing. Only silence and the slow ticking of a brass clock on the parlor mantel. Hensley laughed. "Your brother," he said gently. "Your fast and clever brother. Did you really believe, Mr. Rourke, that I had not anticipated him? Mr. Thorne and his men have been quietly in this town since the morning after your unfortunate visit to my recorder's office. We have had 3 full weeks to prepare for this moment. Every alley watched, every roof considered, every fool who calls himself a sentry replaced by a man who knows his business. Your brother Gideon was apprehended in the alley behind the post office some 40 minutes ago, before he had even climbed to the roof. He is currently bound in my own cellar beneath your feet. Your brother Elijah was taken at the southeast corner of the sheriff's office in the act of placing a charge of dynamite. He is in the cellar as well, both alive for the moment. Their continued health will depend entirely on your cooperation in the next 2 minutes." I felt something fall away inside me. I had brought my brothers into a trap. Hensley took another step forward. His pale eyes were on Cora now. "Cora May," he said softly, "come here, child. Come back to me. You are confused and frightened, and these men have filled your head with terrible lies about my intentions. We have been delayed long enough. The wedding will go forward at noon tomorrow as planned. Reverend Holcomb is already prepared to perform the ceremony. The town is expecting it. Come. Come to me now. I forgive you everything." She did not move. "Set the gun down," Mr. Rourke Thorne said quietly behind me. "Set it on the floor, slowly, with your left hand. Now." I bent. I laid the Colt on the polished pine boards. 2 of the gray-coated detectives stepped forward. One bound my wrists behind my back with a length of rough sash cord. The other patted me down for a hideout gun. He found the small belly knife inside my coat and tossed it to the hearth. "Excellent," said Hensley. "Excellent. Now, Cora May. Come." She still did not move. She was very pale. Her right hand had closed around the small object hidden inside her bodice. And in that frozen moment, in that warm parlor, with the Christmas tree blazing, and the candles flickering, and the smell of pine and beeswax and brandy in the air, Cora May Whitfield drew the first pearl-handled derringer from her undershirt, and she fired. The first shot took Augustus Thorne high in the right shoulder, the same shoulder he had still been favoring from the wound she had not been able to give him in the cabin 5 weeks before. He spun. He fell against the doorframe. His revolver discharged once into the wall behind him. Her second shot, fired without aiming, took the detective on Thorne's left side through the throat. Both shots in less than 2 seconds. The parlor exploded. I am an old man, gentlemen, and I have lived through a war and 3 gunfights, and the long, hard hunting in Wyoming, and I have never seen another piece of work like what came next. Cora dropped the empty derringer, snatched my Colt from the floor at her feet, and went down behind the heavy mahogany side table. Her first round from the Colt put a detective on the side stair down on the carpet for good. Her second round caught a third man in the chest as he tried to rush her. She moved. She fired. She moved again. I tore at the cord on my wrists. The detective who had bound me was already firing his revolver wildly, his face white with shock. A round meant for me struck the brass clock on the mantel and shattered it. A second round took out the parlor window in a great glittering spray of glass. I drove my shoulder into him, knocked him sideways across the upright piano, and the keyboard cracked open beneath him in a discordant jangle of tortured strings. I got my hands free. I picked up his fallen revolver. I shot him through the side of the head. A great muffled boom rolled through the wood floors of the house. It was the sheriff's office. It was Elijah's first charge. We learned later in the long telling of the night that came after what had truly happened. My brother had set the fuses on a slow burn before he was ever taken. He had cut them long enough to give him 3/4 of an hour, the way a careful engineer cuts a fuse when he is working alone in dangerous country. The Pinkerton men who had captured him at the southeast corner of the building had searched him for weapons, but had not searched the building itself. They had marched him to the judge's cellar and bound him there beside Gideon. They had not known about the fuse already burning slow and patient in a boiler room behind the sheriff's office, 2 blocks away. Whatever the cause, the dynamite had gone. The whole front parlor of the judge's house shook. 3 glass panes in the bay window collapsed inward. A china shepherdess fell from the mantel and shattered on the bricks of the hearth. In the chaos, a second figure appeared at the side door. Gideon. His hands were free. The explosion at the sheriff's office had shaken the foundations of the judge's house, and the single guard who had been left to watch the cellar had run upstairs to see what had happened. Gideon had used the moment to work the rough sash cord on his own wrists against the iron edge of a cellar shelf, the way a man learns to work a cord when he has spent 5 months in a Kansas jail planning his escape. He had freed himself. He had freed Elijah. They had taken the guns of 2 men who had come down to investigate the noise, and they had come up the cellar stairs at exactly the moment we needed them most. His shirt was bloody at the collar. There was a long, ugly cut across his forehead where someone had hit him with the butt of a rifle, and the blood from that cut had streamed down the side of his face and dried in his beard. But he had a gun in each hand, 2 stubby revolvers he had taken off whoever had been guarding him, and his green eyes were the eyes of a man who had been very angry for a great many years. Behind him in the doorway came Elijah, limping, pale. A bandage of torn shirt cloth wrapped around his left thigh, where he had been clipped by some round during his capture. But upright, but fighting, with a small leather case clutched against his chest as if it were a baby. The remaining gray coats broke. One of them dropped his weapon and put his hands in the air. Another tried to flee through the back kitchen and was met by Gideon's left-hand revolver. The last man, Augustus Thorne himself, dragged himself to his feet against the doorframe with his right arm hanging useless and his left hand still on his revolver. Elijah lifted the small leather case. "Mr. Thorne," he said, in the gentlest voice you have ever heard, "you may wish to look at this." He flipped the case open. Inside, packed in straw, were 3 sticks of dynamite wired together. and connected by a length of copper wire to a small electrical detonator switch. A genuine field detonator, the kind a railroad engineer used to clear avalanche shelves. The second charge, Elijah said quietly. The one I did not finish setting tonight, Mr. Thorne. The one I had already set yesterday afternoon at your hotel. In the basement beneath the boiler room. Beneath the rooms of the men of your agency, and beneath the room your wife and your 4 children have taken for the holiday. Thorne went perfectly still. I checked the registry, Elijah said. Mrs. Thorne. 3 boys and a girl. The youngest is 6. They came in on the train 2 days ago from Denver to spend Christmas with you. The desk clerk was very proud to point out a family man in his establishment. You are bluffing, Thorne whispered. Possibly, Elijah said. But are you willing to wager the lives of 4 children on it? I have the trigger in my coat pocket. My thumb is on the brass plunger. If anything befalls the 3 of us, my thumb will release. If you fire a single round more, my thumb will release. If you cry out, my thumb will release. Thorne's good eye flicked to me, then to Cora, then to Gideon. He let out a long, slow breath. He lowered the revolver. He set it on the parlor floor. Stand down, he said hoarsely to his one surviving man. The contract is closed. Lay down your arms. The man obeyed. It was over in less than a minute. $5,000 a month, Thorne said. He looked at Hensley with a flat hatred I would not soon forget. $5,000 a month, Judge, and a bonus of $15,000 at the wedding. I have lost 6 men of my agency to your contract. 6 men, wives, children, friends. I will not lose any more. The contract is dissolved, effective immediately. He limped past us toward the front door, gathering his man and his fallen comrade as he went. At the threshold he paused. He turned back, his one good eye fixed on me. Mr. Rourke, he said. Mr. Thorne. Merry Christmas to you, sir. He went out into the cold. The 2 surviving detectives carried Augustus Thorne and the wounded man between them down the steps of the porch. The front door swung shut behind them on its heavy hinge. The candles on the great Christmas tree flickered and steadied. And in the warm, bright parlor of his own house, surrounded by the wreckage of his own ambush, Judge Josiah Hensley stood alone. He had picked up nothing. He had drawn no weapon. He had backed slowly during the chaos against the cold marble of the fireplace mantel, and his pale gray eyes were now darting from face to face like the eyes of a cornered weasel. But there was still, gentlemen, still that strange amused light in them. A standoff, then, he said softly. Cora stepped out from behind the mahogany table. She still held my Colt. The barrel was warm. Her dark hair had come partly loose from its braid, and a single dark curl had fallen across her forehead. There was a small spatter of blood across her left cheek, not her own. Her green eyes were fixed on the man at the hearth. Judge Hensley moved very fast for a man of 52. He had been measuring the distance. He had been waiting. In the moment Cora stepped clear of the table, he lunged. He caught her by the upper arm. He spun her against him. From inside his velvet jacket, he produced a long, thin Bowie knife with a polished bone handle, and he laid the edge of it cold against the white skin of her throat. The four of us froze. He smiled at me over her shoulder. "Mr. Rourke," he said pleasantly, "lay your weapon on the floor." I did not move. "She is mine," Hensley said. "She has always been mine. From the moment her stepfather accepted my $800 in Boston, she has been my lawful property under the laws of 2 states. The wedding is a formality. The papers are signed. If I cannot have her on Christmas morning as I planned, then I shall have her this Christmas Eve, in the only way left to me. And 1,000 witnesses will tell the territory tomorrow that I cut her throat in defense of my own home against 3 armed brigands. Lay your weapon on the floor, Mr. Rourke." Now, I laid the second revolver, the one I had taken from the dead detective, on the floor beside the first. Hensley pressed the knife slightly tighter. A small, bright bead of blood appeared on Cora's pale throat and rolled slowly down into the collar of her shirt. She did not move. "Cora," I said softly. "Cora. May, look at me." She raised her eyes. They met mine over the bright steel of the blade. They were very calm. "5 weeks," I said to her. 5 weeks of teaching. The thumb, the wrist, the way out of any hold. Do you remember?" Her fingers, hanging loose at her side, twitched once. "I do not need fingers, my love," I said. "I need your teeth." Hensley, who had been watching me, his smile beginning to fade as he tried to understand what I was saying, did not see her move. She turned her head. She opened her mouth. She bit down on the back of his right hand on the soft web of flesh between his thumb and his forefinger. And she bit down with the full force of a woman who had spent 5 weeks remembering how to want to live. Her teeth went through skin, through muscle. They struck bone. He screamed. The Bowie knife clattered to the parlor floor. He flung her away from him with a great convulsive jerk. She went down on her hands and knees at the edge of the rug, her dark hair fallen across her face, and her right hand was already going inside her sheepskin coat. She came up with the second Derringer, the matched twin to the one that lay empty on the parlor floor, the one she had carried on Gideon's standing instruction in the hidden pocket sewn into the lining of her own coat. Always 2, my brother had told her in the cabin. A man searches once, never twice. The second one did not fail. She fired. The little gun barked. The round took Judge Josiah Hensley square in the center of his white linen shirt, and a small dark flower bloomed on the cloth above his heart. He staggered. He looked down at the spreading red bloom on his chest. He looked back up at her. His face wore an expression of perfect, unfeigned, almost childlike astonishment. "You," he whispered. "You." He took one slow step toward her, then another. The blood was running freely down the front of his velvet smoking jacket, now dripping from the hem, in a slow, steady patter onto the polished pine floor. His knees gave way. He sat down very suddenly on the bricks of the hearth. his back against the cold stone, his pale gray eyes still wide with that astonished disbelief. I crossed the parlor. I picked up my Colt. I stood over him. "Margaret," I said. He looked up at me. "You killed her," I said. "The fever was a brown bottle on your nightstand." A wet, small laugh moved his lips. "Margaret," he whispered. Margaret was so tiresome. She kept the books. She would not sign them over. "Hannah," I said. His pale eyes flickered. "Hannah Rourke," I said. "My wife. Wyoming. October of '78. Your brother Cornelius hired the band that took her. Did you know about it?" He smiled. Even dying, the man could smile. "My brother," he whispered. "Cornelius, he was a coward. He paid them only 500. I told him he was a fool. I would have done it for nothing, done what I asked. Killed her," he whispered. "She had a sharp tongue. She had a sharp mind. She was going to ruin us both. He paid them 500. I told them to take the child too. The child was a witness. The child should not have been left." Gideon was at my side now. Elijah was at my other side. Cora stood a little behind me with the second derringer hanging loose in her hand. None of us spoke. The fire in the parlor hearth crackled softly. The Christmas tree candles flickered in the cold air from the broken window. "Ruth," I said quietly. Her name was Ruth. Hensley's lips moved. No sound came out this time. I raised the Colt. I shot Judge Josiah Hensley between the eyes. He slumped sideways on the hearth, and his head settled gently against the brick at the corner of the fireplace, and the small, blood-dark flour on his white shirt spread slowly to the size of a man's open hand, and then stopped spreading. The candles on the Christmas tree had begun to gutter in their tin holders. One of them near the top had tipped sideways during the gunfight. A small flame had caught on the dry pine needles. Even as we stood there, the fire began to spread. By the time we had reached the front door, the lower branches of the tree were burning. By the time we had closed the door behind us and crossed the porch into the cold, the entire parlor was alight. We took the back alleys out of Silverton. Townspeople were already beginning to gather in the street in front of the house. They had heard the dynamite. They had seen the flames. By morning, they would find Judge Hensley in his own parlor, with a single bullet through his head and another through his heart. And they would find the dead detectives in his fine front rooms, and they would find the burned corpse of the only man who could have lied about what had happened. By the time the marshals from Denver arrived 3 days later, the truth would have already begun to spread. We rode through the rest of the night and all of the following day. We did not stop at the cabin. We had agreed weeks before that the cabin was lost to us now. Gideon had taken the worst of our papers, our small store of coin, and the few possessions any of us could not bear to leave. And he had cached them at a friend's homestead in the next valley 3 days before. We rode east through the back country, and we crossed the divide before the next snowstorm caught us. And on the 2nd of January in the year 1884, we came down into a small valley in southern Wyoming, where a homestead lay vacant and waiting for us. The man who had arranged the homestead was a lawyer from Denver named Theodore Fairbanks. Mr. Fairbanks had been a friend of my father's when both of them were young men in Pennsylvania. He had read about the Hensley business in the Rocky Mountain News, and within a week he had ridden the train to Denver and engaged a federal judge on Cora's behalf. By the middle of January, the Whitfield silver mine had been formally and lawfully transferred to Cora May Whitfield by order of the federal probate court. Barnaby Stone had been arrested in Boston by Pinkerton agents working on a federal warrant, and he was awaiting trial on charges of conspiracy to commit murder. Sheriff Horatio Blackburn of Silverton had fled south across the border and was never seen again. The arrest warrants on Gideon were quashed by the same federal judge in the same week. It was at the kitchen table of that small Wyoming homestead that Cora made her decision about the mine. She had laid the papers out in front of her on the rough pine wood. $1,200,000, a working silver claim, equipment, buildings, a house in Leadville, a small stable of horses, stock in a freight company, the full weight of her mother's secret inheritance. She looked at it for a long time. She looked at the three of us sitting around her at the table. "I do not want it," she said quietly. "Cora," I said. "It was bought with my mother's blood," she said, "and with Margaret Hensley's blood, and it would have been bought with mine. I do not want to live on money that came from such a place, not $1 of it." She pushed the papers across the table to me. "I want you to write to Mr. Fairbanks tomorrow," she said. "I want you to tell him to sell the mine. I want him to take the proceeds and to use them to build schools. Schools for orphan children. In Boston, where I grew up. In Denver, where Margaret was buried. In Leadville. In St. Louis. In every city he can reach. Schools that will teach girls as well as boys. Schools that will take in the children no one else will take. That is what I want." "What do you want for yourself?" Elijah asked her gently. She raised her head. She looked at me. She looked at my brothers. Her green eyes were very clear and very steady. "I want a home," she said. "I want a place where the doors are not locked from the outside. I want a piano to play in the evenings. I want the four of you. That is all I want. That is everything I want." I rose from the table. I walked around it. I knelt beside her chair, the way a man my age does not often kneel, and I took her small hand in both of mine. "Then we will build it. Cora May," I said. "Then we will build all of it." We were married in the Wyoming homestead in the spring of 1884. It was a small ceremony. A circuit preacher rode out from Cheyenne. Theodore Fairbanks came from Denver as a witness. My brothers stood at my side. Cora wore a simple white cotton dress that Elijah's hands had helped to sew, and her dark hair was pinned up under a small wreath of mountain wildflowers. And when she walked across the meadow toward me on Gideon's arm, I felt for the first time in 5 years that the dead in their distant graves were smiling. Our daughter was born 10 months later. We named her Hannah Ruth. The years that followed were the good years of my life. We grew the homestead into a working cattle ranch, 3,000 acres of fenced grazing land in the foothills below the snowy range. Gideon ran the cattle operations and was eventually appointed deputy sheriff of Albany County, a post he held with quiet competence for 31 years. He courted and married a tall Lutheran girl named Beatrice Sutton, the blacksmith's daughter from Laramie, and they had 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls, all of whom called me Uncle Si until the day each of them grew up. Elijah finished his medical degree at the University of Colorado in 1885 and came home to the ranch to set up the only doctor's practice within 50 miles. He never married. He told me once, sitting on the porch of his small adjoining cabin, that the love he had for our family was as much love as one heart could hold. I did not argue with him. I think he was telling the truth. Cora and I had 3 more children after Hannah Ruth, 2 boys and a girl. The boys grew up to be ranchers. The girl grew up to marry a Methodist minister in Cheyenne, and she has children of her own now, and grandchildren. And she comes to see me on Sunday afternoons when the weather allows. Cora May Rourke played the piano every evening of our marriage. She played in our parlor with the windows open in summer and closed in winter. And the children gathered around her, and the dogs lay at her feet. And the lamplight made her dark hair shine the way it had shone on the bearskin rug in the cabin, on Black Bear Pass, on the first night I had brought her in from the storm. She read Tennyson out loud to me when my eyes began to fail. She nursed my brother Gideon through his last long winter when his lungs gave out in 1915. She nursed Elijah through his quiet death in the spring of 1920. She cried for both of them as if they had been her own brothers, which, of course, they had been. She herself died in the autumn of 1918 of a fever. She was 55 years old. The fever came on her in October, and she was gone in 11 days. She knew at the end. She held my hand. She told me she had had a longer and a fuller life than she could ever have imagined that night in the wagon, and that she was not afraid, and that she would wait for me on the other side. I buried her on the bluff above the river where she had loved to sit in the long summer evenings beneath a small white headstone of Cheyenne marble. I had Hannah Ruth's name carved on the stone beside her own, my first daughter dead in Wyoming 40 years before. They are buried together up there. They are together still. I went up there yesterday morning, gentlemen, the snow being light and my old joints willing. I sat for an hour beside the 2 stones in the cold, thin December sun. I told them about the snowfall this year. I told them about the new calf my eldest grandson is breaking. I told them, as I always tell them, about the man their family had become. I am 75 years old. The year is 1923. The world has gone strange around me. There are motor cars now in Laramie, and electric lights in the new ranch house my son built down in the valley. The grandchildren listen to a wooden box that plays music sent through the air, and they laugh when I shake my head at it. The horses I broke as a young man have been gone for 20 years. The cabin where my brothers and I lived is a ruin now, slowly being eaten by the snow and the high country wind. And one of these summers I mean to ride up there one last time, before my own legs give out for good. I sit alone tonight. The fire is still burning, gentlemen, the same fire I built the night I carried her in through the door. I can see from this chair 2 photographs on the table beside the bed. One is a small daguerreotype of Hannah holding little Ruth taken in Wyoming in the autumn of 1877, the year before I lost them. The other is a portrait of Cora May taken in Laramie in the summer of 1885, 6 months after our daughter was born. 2 women, 2 great loves. The first one taken from me. The second one given to me against every expectation I had ever held about my own broken life. I tell you this story tonight, friends, because I am an old man, and old men cannot keep their stories forever. Stories want to be told. They press against the inside of the ribs of an old man, until the only relief is to set them down somewhere in writing or in speech, where another soul might lift them up after the old man is gone. So this is mine. This is the story of 3 mountain men who were dead inside, and a young Boston bride who had been sold like a piece of livestock to a man who meant to murder her on the Christmas Eve. We all walked into a fine 3-story house in Silverton, Colorado, and walked back out as a family. The truth I learned from it I will leave for you to take or leave as you see fit. But I will say it once before I send you on your way. In this hard old world, friends, there will always be men who hurt the helpless. Men in fine clothes. Men in robes of office. Men whose smiles fool the towns they live in. There will always be such men, and there will always be young women they buy. And there will always be quiet houses where lamps burn late and weeping carries through the windows when no one is listening. But there will also sometimes be other men, broken men, quiet men, men in cabins above the tree line who thought their fighting days were done, men who can be called back if the hour is dark enough and the cause is true enough to stand once more against the kind of evil that wears a black coat to church on Sunday morning. Be one of those men, gentlemen, if the chance comes to you in your own life. Be one of those men. The fire is dying now. My hands are tired. The snow is falling outside my window the same as it fell on that night long ago. May God bless you and keep you. May He bless and keep the women you love, and the children of those women, and the homes you have built around them in your turn. And Merry Christmas, friends. From a very old man in Wyoming. Merry Christmas to you all.